Now go to action creators. The first thing that I want to do here is I'm going to import add API data. I'm going to export another function called add API data. It's going to take in API data, which is going to be of type show, right? And then in here, we're going to return a well-formed action object, which is going to be of type add API data and payload API data. So in particular here, we're actually not going to be calling add API data outside of this particular function, right? We're going to actually handle this inside of action creators. But it's a good idea to export it anyway. Say, for example, you got API data maybe from local storage, right? For example, you could use this add API data action to kind of load it from different sources, right? This is going to be useful other places other than just stuff coming back from the API. So that's why it's good to do that. This is also good because now this is testable, right? So I can import it into my test suite and test it. And it's a good idea to test action creators. In fact, we're going to do it. So, cool. OK, so now everything's all ready for us to start adding action or API data into our Redux store. Now we want to tackle the problem of making that asynchronous request inside of a thunk. So what we're going to do now is we're going to export another function called getAPIDetails. Okay, this is going to take in an IMDb ID, which is going to be a string. Okay. Now, these action creators always return objects, right? That's kind of the contract there. However, this is going to return a thunk, right? And what is a thunk? A thunk is a function, right? So this function returns a function. It kind of throws people off, but just remember that we're dispatching this function into the Redux store, and then Redux is going to say, cool, this is a deferred action, so something's going to come from this. I'm going to call this function and wait for it to dispatch, okay? So that's why here you're going to say return function. So it's going to be a function that has dispatch injected into it, which is going to be a function. Okay, so that's why we're returning a function here. And then in here, we're just going to do pretty much what we were doing inside of details. We're just going to make our Axios request here. In fact, you need to go import Axios at the top. Import Axios from Axios. Okay, and then we're going to say Axios.get, and this is going to go to http://localhost:3000/ and then we're just going to put that IMDb ID right there, okay? And then we're going to say .then, thine.then, response, and we're just going to, the response is going to be something that the API gave back to us. All we're going to do at this point is now we're going to use this dispatch function, which Redux gives you, to dispatch an action, right? So this is where the thunk is resolving and finally giving out an action. So it's going to say dispatch add API data with response.data. Then, as always is the case with an API, it's usually a good idea to have a catch statement at the end, just in case something goes wrong. It's going to be an error. And here I just say console.error so it doesn't get dropped on the floor. Axios error. Error. It's going to warn here, it's going to say, hey, I don't like console logs going down to production. But for me, this is useful to have as a developer, so I'm just going to say, hey, ESLint, go ahead and shut up about it. So we're just saying, hey, disable the console warning just for this particular line. So to recap, again, this is a thunk. This particular piece, this function that gets returned here, that's the thunk, right? The thunk function is going to be invoked by Redux, right? The Redux thunk thing, that middleware that we put in there. It's going to inject this dispatch function and to say, cool, go do whatever you need to do, and then call me back whenever you have the action that you want to do, right? So what we do is we go out to our API via Axios, and once it resolves, it's going to say, cool, now I have the action data that I want to dispatch. So I call dispatch with add API data, which gives me back a real action object, which then gets passed into Redux. So this is how you do asynchronous code with Redux. So I would say thunks are the easiest way. I don't want to say easiest, maybe simplest. There's just not a lot to it. It's just a callback, right? But there are other ways to do this. You can dispatch promises with Redux promise, observables with Redux observables, and generators with Redux sagas. And I would say those are the most common ones.
Well, there's a bunch of debating going on about
which one's the best?
Redux and the whole fact that you have tons of actions and how this scales, and whether or not someone like Facebook is using Redux and across.
Like I assert pretty unequivocally that this does scale, right? So right now, if you go to our reducers file, we have all of our reducers living in one file. Typically in a large application, you're going to separate your reducers into separate files. But when you're using combined reducers like this one reducer owns API data, right? It owns that one particular piece of the state tree, and it has no concept of search term, for example, right? So the fact that these are siloed from each other is why this scales, right? If you're worrying about every single object and every single reducer, that gets unruly, especially when you start getting like 50 things in your Redux store. But the fact that these are so siloed from each other, I can keep them in separate parts of my application, and they can be tested individually. That's why this scales, for sure. I confidently assert that this scales.
And then what about adding typings to, say, some of the things you're returning and whatnot to make the actions
like this stuff right
clear.
Here? This, the response and the error typings are coming from the Axios typings from flow typed. So that's why we don't have to type these. It knows that there's a response.data. You could do it explicitly if you needed to, but I don't think you need to. Yeah, there's nothing that you need to do with this in particular right now. And add API data, we already told that the API data is going to be a show, and that's fine. So.
They said, does something like immutable JS help with the immutability of state?
For sure. Immutable JS, and there's also the other one that I can't think of off the top of my head. There's a couple libraries that handle immutability with JavaScript. Immutability just makes things a little bit safer, right? That you can't directly modify things, and it also allows for really fast checking for things to say, like, is this the same object as this? No, cool, they're not equal anymore, and there's no sort of like deep nesting that you need to check. That definitely helps. My problem with immutable.js and why I don't use it and why I don't teach it is it's a pretty large library, and yeah, so I don't, the value that it gives me my developer experience does not match how big the library is. I think it's, last time I was checking, I think it was like 50 kilobytes, which is, for me, kind of a non-starter, right? I think it's bigger than React, which is a problem, right? So it is cool. There are reasons to use it. I've just not so far chosen to use it.
I'm sure there's micro libraries and whatnot as well.
I'm sure. I think Jaffer was writing one last time I talked to him. Any other questions? To be honest with you, a lot of that same similar type benefits that Immutable is going to gain you, you're going to get from having typings with your language, right? Because it's going to catch some similar problems like, hey, you're modifying this and probably shouldn't be modifying that. So a type system can help catch similar bugs. Not totally the same. And immutable, in particular cases, will have some speed benefits just by checking like high level, shallow checking. Is this the same object as this? But so far, I haven't felt the need to use it personally.
And then a few people were commenting that they use React set state for UI state, and then Redux for application state.
Yep, totally. We talked about that yesterday too. But I agree. I think that's a good thing to do.